The first thing Eleanor Price learned about Wyoming was that the wind could find every mistake a person had made. It came through the crack beneath the kitchen door, through the loose frame around the bedroom window, and through a hole in the roof no bigger than a silver dollar. By midnight, the little house was making so many sounds that Eleanor stopped trying to sleep. Boards creaked. Tin rattled. Something scratched inside the wall. She lay beneath 2 wool blankets, fully dressed, and stared into the dark. Back in Denver, silence had meant her husband was angry. Here, silence would have been a gift. She arrived at the property on the last Monday of September, 1948, carrying 1 suitcase, a sewing box, $38, and a letter from a dead woman. The dead woman was her Aunt Margaret, whom Eleanor had not seen in 11 years. Margaret had left her 25 acres outside a town called Red Creek, along with a 2-room house, a sagging barn, a dry well, and taxes that had not been paid since spring. The county clerk had explained all of that in a voice that suggested Eleanor should refuse the inheritance. She had accepted before he finished talking. There was nothing left for her in Denver except a rented room above a bakery, 3 dresses she had sewn herself, and a divorce decree folded inside an envelope she never opened. The dress factory had let her go in August. They said orders were down. Her husband had left the year before. He said many things on his way out, but the one Eleanor remembered was this: "You don't know how to make a life." When she saw Margaret's land for the first time, she almost believed him. The grass had gone pale from drought. One side of the barn leaned toward the ground. The fence had collapsed in 2 places, and the hand pump near the house produced nothing but a rusty cough. A neighbor named Mr. Larkin drove her out from town in his flatbed truck. He unloaded her suitcase, looked at the house, and then looked at her. "You planning to stay long?" "I own it," Eleanor said. "That wasn't my question." She met his eyes. "Then I don't have an answer yet." Mr. Larkin gave a small grunt, climbed into his truck, and drove away. Eleanor stood alone in the yard until the dust settled. That first night, she ate crackers and canned peaches by lantern light. The second night, she found mouse droppings in the flour tin. On the third morning, the kitchen ceiling leaked, even though there had not been any rain. By the end of the first week, Eleanor had made a list. Fix the roof. Find water. Patch the stovepipe. Pay the taxes. Then, beneath those 4 things, she wrote one more. Decide whether to leave. She carried the list in her apron pocket while she cleaned the house. Margaret had kept everything. Bent nails, empty jars, feed sacks, pieces of string tied into neat bundles. In a bedroom drawer, Eleanor found old receipts, seed catalogs, and a photograph of Margaret standing beside a row of raised wooden cages. And behind the photograph was a note written in pencil. "The rabbits paid the taxes when nothing else did." Eleanor turned the photograph over again. Margaret looked younger in it, maybe 40. Her hair was tied back with a scarf. One hand rested on a cage door. The other held a white rabbit against her chest. Outside, behind the barn, Eleanor found what was left of the rabbitry. There were 6 hutches in a long row beneath a slanted roof. 3 had collapsed. 2 were filled with leaves and mouse nests. The last one still had a door, though the wire had rusted through at the bottom. Eleanor stood there for a long time. She knew nothing about rabbits beyond what anyone knew. They had soft fur. They chewed. They multiplied. But she knew wood. Her father had been a cabinet maker before his hands became too stiff to work. Eleanor had spent half her childhood in his shop, sorting screws and sweeping sawdust. She knew how to measure twice. She knew how to brace a corner. She knew rotten wood from sound wood. She also knew what it felt like when people looked at something damaged and decided it was not worth saving. That afternoon, she took apart the first hutch. By sunset, her hands were blistered and one knuckle was bleeding. She had removed every bad board and stacked the good ones beside the barn. The next morning, she walked 4 miles into Red Creek. The hardware store belonged to a man named Walter Green, who wore a green visor and kept a pencil behind each ear. Eleanor placed her list on the counter. Wire mesh, hinges, roofing paper, 2x4s, nails, and a handsaw. Walter read the list. "What are you building?" "Rabbit hutches." He looked over her shoulder as if expecting a husband to appear and explain. "You raising rabbits?" "I'm building the hutches first." That's not usually how people answer. It's the answer I have. Walter studied her for another second, then began gathering the supplies. She did not have enough money for everything. She removed the roofing paper, then the handsaw. Walter noticed. "There's an old saw in back," he said, "missing 2 teeth, but it cuts straight." "How much?" "You bring it back when you're done." "I may not be done for a while." "Then bring it back when you leave." Eleanor looked at him. He looked embarrassed. "People usually leave," he said. She paid for the wire and carried the supplies home in a wheelbarrow Walter let her borrow. For 9 days, Eleanor worked on the hutches. She replaced the rotten legs and raised them high enough to keep the cages dry. She repaired the doors, stretched new wire, and added a sloped cover that sent rainwater away from the feed area. She built nesting boxes from scraps of pine. At night, she read Margaret's notebooks. The pages were crowded with numbers: breeding dates, litter sizes, feed costs, weights, notes about heat, cold, illness, and temperament. Beside one rabbit's name, Margaret had written, "Good mother, bites everyone else." Beside another, "Beautiful coat, useless father." Eleanor laughed for the first time in months. Near the back of the final notebook, Margaret had listed breeders in 3 nearby counties. Most of the names had been crossed out. One had not. Beatrice Cole, 6 miles east of Red Creek. New Zealand whites, honest stock. Eleanor went to see her on a cold Thursday morning. Beatrice Cole was nearly 70 and no taller than Eleanor's shoulder. She had silver hair, mud on her boots, and a way of asking questions that made every answer feel like testimony. "How much shelter do you have?" "6 hutches, 3 repaired, 3 almost done." "Water?" "Hand-carried from town until I repair the well." "Feed?" 2 sacks of alfalfa pellets. "Oats. Hay from the barn loft if it's still good." "Money?" "Not much." "Experience?" "Less than I need." Beatrice's mouth moved slightly. It might have been a smile. She led Eleanor into a long shed where rows of white rabbits watched from clean cages. "They don't care about your intentions," Beatrice said. "They care whether the water is clean, the feed is steady, and the roof keeps the weather off." "That sounds fair." It is. People are usually less fair. Eleanor bought 3 does and 1 buck. The rabbits cost $24. It was nearly everything she had left. Beatrice placed each rabbit into a wooden carrier, then handed Eleanor a small paper sack. "What's this?" "Mineral salt and dried raspberry leaves. One of the does gets nervous after travel." "I didn't pay for this." "No." Eleanor waited. Beatrice frowned. "Don't make kindness into a debt. It ruins it." The 4 rabbits arrived at the property just before dusk. Eleanor set the carriers beside the repaired hutches and opened them one at a time. The first doe came out cautiously, nose moving. The second kicked hard enough to bruise Eleanor's wrist. The third sat in the corner and refused to move until Eleanor lifted her gently. The buck stepped out as if he owned the land. Eleanor named them June, Mabel, Rose, and Franklin. She told herself the names were for record-keeping. That night, the wind rose again. Eleanor woke at 2 in the morning and heard a faint tapping outside. She pulled on her boots, took the lantern, and crossed the yard. The rabbits were safe, but the roof over the hutches had come loose at one corner. Every gust lifted it and dropped it against the frame. Eleanor climbed onto a feed crate and held the roof down with one hand while hammering with the other. The wind pulled at her coat. Dust filled her eyes. Franklin thumped inside his cage, furious at the disturbance. "Believe me," Eleanor shouted. "I don't like it either." She drove in the last nail and stood there breathing hard. Then she heard it. The quiet chewing of 4 rabbits eating hay. Small, ordinary sounds, but they meant the roof was holding. By November, Eleanor had repaired the stovepipe and one section of the barn. She traded sewing work for a load of firewood and paid half the overdue taxes. She had not fixed the well. Every other day, she filled metal cans from the pump behind Walter's hardware store and hauled them home in a borrowed wagon. People in town had started calling her Margaret's niece. Some said it kindly. Others said it the way they might say, "Poor thing." Winter arrived early. The first snow came on November 12th. 2 weeks later, the temperature fell below zero and stayed there. Water froze in the rabbit bowls within an hour. Eleanor began carrying warm bottles beneath her coat, changing them before dawn, at noon, and again after dark. She packed straw around the nesting boxes and hung old feed sacks along the north side of the hutches. Then Rose stopped eating. Eleanor noticed because Rose always ate first. She offered oats. Rose turned away. She checked her teeth, her belly, and her breathing the way Margaret's notebook described. Nothing seemed obviously wrong, which frightened Eleanor more. By evening, Rose sat hunched in the back of the cage. Eleanor wrapped her in a towel and walked through blowing snow to Beatrice Cole's farm. 6 miles. The road disappeared after the first mile. Eleanor kept the fence line on her right, and Rose pressed against her chest beneath the coat. When Beatrice opened the door, she did not ask why Eleanor had come. She took one look at the rabbit and said, "Kitchen table." Rose had a blockage, likely from eating too much dry feed and not drinking enough in the cold. Beatrice showed Eleanor how to massage her belly and feed her warm water a little at a time. "You caught it early," she said. "Will she live?" "She might." That's not an answer. It's the only honest one. Eleanor stayed beside Rose until morning. At sunrise, the rabbit nibbled a piece of hay. Eleanor sat back in the chair and covered her face with both hands. Beatrice poured coffee. "You're attached now," she said. "I'm responsible." That's usually how it starts. Rose recovered. 3 weeks later, she gave birth to 7 kits. Eleanor found them before dawn, pink and blind, packed together beneath a layer of fur Rose had pulled from her own chest. One kit lay outside the nest box, cold and still. Eleanor picked it up. There was no movement. She held it between her palms and carried it into the house. She warmed a towel near the stove and placed the tiny body inside. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then one hind leg moved. Eleanor leaned closer. The kit opened its mouth. She laughed once, sharply, then began to cry. She returned it to the nest before sunrise. All 7 survived. That winter did not become easier. The wind tore roofing from the barn. Mice got into a feed sack. Eleanor burned the last of her good firewood 2 weeks before spring. But every morning, there was something waiting for her. Water to change, hay to measure, cages to clean. Animals that did not care whether she was lonely, divorced, broke, or afraid. They needed her to get up. So she did. In March, a farmer named Calvin Holt came to the property with his wife and 2 sons. Beatrice had told them Eleanor might have young rabbits for sale. The boys chose a pair from June's first litter. Calvin paid $6. Eleanor counted the money twice after they left. $6 would not save the farm. It would not pay all the taxes or fix the well, but it was money the land had made. Not Denver money, not sewing money, not money handed to her out of pity. That evening, she entered the sale in Margaret's notebook. March 19th. 2 young New Zealands, $6. Then she added a line of her own. First money earned here. Spring softened the ground. Eleanor dug a garden on the south side of the house. She mixed rabbit manure into the soil and planted beans, carrots, onions, and tomatoes. The neighbors warned her that the ground was poor. By June, her tomato plants were waist-high. By July, Walter Green was selling her extra vegetables from a wooden box beside the hardware store. He kept 10% and complained that she never brought enough tomatoes. "You told me nothing grew out there," Eleanor reminded him. "I said not much. You said nothing. I've revised my position. The rabbits multiplied." By midsummer, Eleanor had 23. She built more hutches beneath the shade of the barn and kept detailed records. She learned which does raise strong litters, which buck passed on narrow shoulders, and which pairings produced healthy, fast-growing young. She also learned that success created new problems. More rabbits meant more feed. More feed meant more money. More breeding meant more risk. One hot afternoon, 3 young rabbits began panting heavily. Eleanor moved them into the house, placed cool bricks beneath them, and sat on the floor fanning air toward their cages until the heat broke. The next day, she built shade panels for every hutch. People began coming to her for advice. That surprised her more than the money. Then Samuel Reed drove out from town. He owned the Red Creek Diner, a narrow place beside the train depot with 6 booths and a blue neon sign that flickered when it rained. Samuel was 42, broad-shouldered, and careful with words. His wife had died during the war. Since then, he had raised a daughter, run the diner, and developed a reputation for never making an offer he could not afford. He arrived while Eleanor was repairing a cage latch. "You Eleanor Price?" "Yes." "Walter says you raise rabbits." "Walter says many things." Samuel looked at the rows of hutches. "These look clean." "They are." "He says you keep records." "I do." "He says you have more rabbits than sense." Eleanor stopped working. "Did he?" Samuel's mouth twitched. "No. I added that part to see what you'd do." "What did I do?" Stopped smiling. "I wasn't smiling." "Exactly." She returned to the latch. "What do you want, Mr. Reed?" He stepped closer to the nearest hutch but did not touch it. "I want a steady supplier." "For what?" "My diner." Eleanor understood. She had always known some rabbits would be sold for meat. Margaret's notebooks were clear about that. So was Beatrice. Raising livestock required decisions, and pretending otherwise did not make a person kinder. Still, Eleanor did not answer quickly. Samuel noticed. "I'm not asking for an answer today," he said. "How many?" 6 dressed rabbits a week to start. More in winter, maybe. "I can't supply that now." "I know." "Then why are you here?" "Because I don't need them now. I need them reliably 3 months from now." Eleanor studied him. "What price?" He named one. It was fair, but only barely. She named another. Samuel raised an eyebrow. "That's high." "That's what it costs if you want clean stock, steady weight, and delivery on the same day every week. I can get them cheaper from Casper." "Then get them from Casper." Samuel looked at her for several seconds. Then he nodded. "Meet me halfway." "No." "Why not?" "Because you drove out here." "That means the supplier in Casper isn't reliable." For the first time, Samuel laughed. It was not a loud laugh, but it changed his whole face. "All right," he said. "Your price. 3-month trial. I'll need to calculate feed costs." You just refuse to lower the price. I can still discover the price is too low. Samuel nodded again. I'll come back Friday. You don't need to. Yes, he said. I think I do. After he left, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table until dark. 6 rabbits a week, 24 a month. She would need more breeding stock, more cages, a separate area for young rabbits, and a feed supply she could trust through winter. She would also need to make a decision. This was no longer a hobby. It was no longer a way to survive until something better came along. This could become the something better. Eleanor opened Margaret's final notebook and turned to the last written page. There, beneath a column of numbers, Margaret had written one sentence. Small things become a life if you tend them every day. Eleanor read it twice. Then she took out a clean sheet of paper and began to plan. The new rabbitry took 6 weeks to build. Walter extended her credit for lumber. Beatrice sold her 2 Californian does and a buck at a price lower than she usually charged. Calvin Holt brought over fence posts. Even Mr. Larkin arrived one morning with a roll of roofing paper and claimed he had found it lying beside the road. No road I know, Eleanor said. Different road. You want coffee? I suppose. Samuel came twice a week. He did not offer advice unless she asked. He held boards level, carried feed sacks, and repaired the broken hinge on the barn door. When Eleanor told him a row of cages needed to face east for morning light, he did not argue. When she explained why the quarantine cages had to stand apart from the others, he listened. One afternoon, he reached for a hammer in her hand. Eleanor did not let go. Samuel looked at her. I was only going to help. You are helping. He released the hammer. All right. There was no anger in his voice. No wounded pride. He picked up another board and asked, Where does this go? That small moment stayed with Eleanor longer than she expected. By October, the new building was finished. It had 2 rows of cages, a feed room, wide windows for ventilation, and enough space for Eleanor to work without bending beneath the roof. She whitewashed the walls and hung Margaret's photograph beside the record shelf. The first delivery to Samuel's diner went out on a Thursday morning. He inspected the order, weighed each package, and wrote Eleanor a check. She looked at the amount. You calculated the higher price. That's the price we agreed on. I know. Then why do you look surprised? Eleanor folded the check. I'm learning not to be. The 3-month trial became 6 months. The diner began advertising Thursday rabbit stew. A hotel in the next county placed a monthly order. Families bought breeding pairs. Gardeners bought sacks of aged manure. Eleanor opened an account at the Red Creek Bank. The bank manager asked what occupation he should write on the form. Eleanor almost said seamstress. That was what she had always written. Instead, she said, livestock producer. The manager looked toward the window. What kind of livestock? Rabbits. He hesitated, then wrote it down. Eleanor watched the words appear in black ink. Livestock producer. It felt more permanent than the account balance. By the next fall, she had paid the remaining taxes and repaired the well. The pump produced clear water on the 3rd try. Eleanor stood in the yard, gripping the handle, watching water pour into the bucket. She thought of every mile she had walked carrying cans from town. Then she pumped another bucket simply because she could. The second winter approached quietly. The fields turned gold, then gray. Frost appeared on the hutch roofs before dawn. Eleanor stacked hay in the barn and checked every wall for drafts. Samuel came out one Saturday to help reinforce the rabbitry roof before the heavy snow. They worked without much conversation. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of iron. Samuel drove the final nail and looked over the roofline. That should hold. It held last year. Last year, half of it wasn't attached. It still held. Through stubbornness, maybe. That's a kind of attachment. They climbed down. Inside the rabbitry, the does shifted in their nesting boxes. Young rabbits moved through fresh hay. The air smelled of pine boards, feed, and clean straw. Samuel leaned against the doorframe. You ever think about selling? Eleanor looked up. The rabbits? The place? No. The answer came so quickly that both of them noticed. Samuel rubbed a hand over his jaw. I heard a man from Cheyenne has been asking about land out here. He can ask? You could get more than Margaret paid. I didn't pay anything. You paid plenty. Eleanor looked around the rabbitry, at the cages she had built, at the records written in her hand, at Margaret's photograph on the wall. Through the open doorway, she could see the house, the patched roof, the garden beds covered for winter, the pump beside the kitchen window. A year earlier, every broken thing on the property had seemed like a reason to leave. Now each repair was a reason to stay. Samuel watched her quietly. You miss Denver? He asked. Eleanor tried to picture the rented room above the bakery. She tried to remember the sound of streetcars, factory whistles, and footsteps in the hall. The memory felt farther away than the mountains. Not the way I thought I would, she said. Samuel nodded. Then he reached for his coat. I'm glad. Eleanor looked at him. He did not explain. She did not ask him to. The first heavy snow began that evening. Wind swept across the open land, covering the road and pressing white against the north wall of the barn. At midnight, Eleanor woke to a familiar sound, tapping. She sat up. For one frightened second, she was back in her first week, listening to the house shake around her. Then she recognized it. Not loose roofing, not a broken window. A doe was pulling straw into her nesting box. Eleanor dressed, lit the lantern, and walked through the snow to the rabbitry. Inside, the building was still, warm enough, dry. Rose's daughter, a large Californian doe named Pearl, had begun to kindle. Eleanor closed the door against the wind and waited. One by one the kits arrived. Tiny bodies, closed eyes, quiet breaths. Pearl cleaned them and covered them with fur. Eleanor counted 7, then 8. The last one was small but moving. She adjusted the straw around the nest and set fresh water beside Pearl. Outside, the storm grew louder. The wind pushed against the walls, searching for every weak place. It found none. Eleanor stood beneath the lantern and listened to the low rustle of rabbits settling around her. She thought of her husband's words. You don't know how to make a life. Maybe she had not known then. Maybe no one really knew. Maybe a life was not something a person made all at once. Maybe it was a roof secured before the storm, water carried before sunrise, a sick animal noticed in time, a fair price named without apology, a wall rebuilt, a debt paid, a small thing tended every day. Eleanor closed the nesting box and turned down the lantern. Before stepping outside, she looked once more at the rows of quiet cages and the solid beams above them. Then she pulled the door shut and fastened the latch. Across the yard, light glowed from the windows of her house. Not Margaret's house. Not the place outside Red Creek. Her house. Eleanor crossed the snow toward it while the wind moved over the land behind her. This time, she did not feel as though it was trying to drive her away. It was only winter, and she knew what to do.